Where do you want to start? Okay, to start off with, I was born in Wallace, Idaho, on High Street, in the highest building in the town. And I lived there until I was about 2 years old. My dad had an odd job working for the railroad. After a train went over the hill, he rode a horse over the hill, and then if any fires were started, he had to put the fires out.
Wow.
So he was a fireman. Anyway, we moved to Utah when I was about 2 years old. My grandmother lived in Salt Lake. She left Wallace, Idaho, where she was married. She was married pretty young to my grandfather, Adolph Haupt. And she finally left him. She inherited, let's see, there was, I can't go through the names now. Aunt Hilda, Uncle Charlie, what was the other brother's name? Elvin. No, Elvin was my aunt's son that got killed on a sleigh ride.
Mm.
Anyway, Idaho is something that I didn't remember that much about because, like I said, I left when I was 2 and we went to Salt Lake. And Dad had a farm north of Tremont, a little place called Osgood. And I had a dog and a horse. The nearest neighbor was about 6 miles away.
Wow.
And I stayed there until I got into school. And when I was 5 years old, I don't mean 5 years old, when I was in the first grade, I rode 5 miles to school on a horse. And at noon, we'd take the horses down to the neighbor's place and water them. And I'd goofed off and hadn't gone down with the rest of the guys. And they were coming back, and I was going down to water my horse, and I got out of the road so they had room to race. I decided I could join the race. And Dandy, if you slapped the reins on the side of his neck and dug your heels into his ribs, he'd pivot on his hind feet and land running in the other direction. And he got his feet tangled up and came over backwards on me. And I had him get down on his knees and crawled up on his back and fell off.
Oh.
So I laid there and played possum.
Good boy.
And he, thank God he didn't go home because it would have been 5 miles home and his dad wouldn't have been home and the horse would have been there with Mom and she'd have been crazy. Anyway, he went down, he walked around on the schoolhouse steps and one of the guys came out and they came and found me and called school off and took me home in a buggy. A couple of weeks later, they took me into Tremont and found out I had both pelvis bones fractured. I didn't walk for a year. That bothered me for a number of years, and then I got up here to Montana and came to Montana, well, first we went from there, Utah, when I was 7, we went to north of Idaho Falls, and he farmed sugar beets and potatoes there for 2 years. And you couldn't give the potatoes away. Everybody had good potatoes that year. So then he came to Montana when I was 9 years old. And I went to school up here at the little school, and I had a teacher by the name of Mrs. Goodall. Her husband was an assay officer in town. Very nice guy, and so was she. She said to me, she says, "You seem boring." I said, "Well, I'm in the 3rd grade and I can answer all the 8th grade questions. What is there?" She said, "There's books." that was my downfall, to falling in love with books, because every week she'd bring me a new book on a different subject. She would not take one of them back.
Mm.
And now we have books and books and books and books. You put them all on one side of the house, and I think it'd tip over. Anyway, that was my basics for learning things. Then when we had the Depression, something happened real interesting. We were living up on the bench between here and East Town on the farm. Dad was farming. And we went to town one day, and Dad wrote a couple of checks, and he stopped at the bank in East Town on the way home, and he says, "I need to know how much money I got in the bank." And the banker says, "Earl, you're supposed to keep track of that in your bank book. You got a place for it. You should take care of that." He said, "Well, you tell me what I got," and he says, "You won't need to worry about it anymore." So I told him how much he had in the bank, and he subtracted the amount that he'd used for checks that day and took the rest of it home. And when he went to go back to put it in the bank in Helena, the banks had folded.
Wow.
So he got all of his money out of the bank. Of course, it was probably less than $100, but anyway, later on they started paying dividends on that, and somewhere up in the shop, in one of the file cabinets up there, a while back I found a check for the 3 checks that he made. They had a check for 4 cents for him.
Oh my gosh.
I thought that was rather interesting. Anyway, needless to say, he didn't put the money in the bank. And after that year, he figured up, after he paid for the harvesting and saved his seed grain for the next year, he figured up that he made less than $10 for the year. Of course, we lived on chickens and garden stuff, and that's one reason I don't eat eggs, eat chickens. And then another reason I don't eat chickens is when they moved in. Then anyway, he sent me down to California with my grandmother, Hopped. And Margaret was down there at that time, married to George Knudsen. And she was my favorite aunt. She's just something special. Anyway, she died with pneumonia when she was in her 30s. She had one son, George Jr., and he was a real nice kid. I think he's dead now. But he went in the Army during World War II, and I was in the Navy. I've got a picture of him someplace. And actually, I came back to Montana after a couple of years down there with my grandmother. And my Aunt Margaret was working for a mortgage guarantee company down there, and they kept moving us from one house to another. I think we went to 7 different schools in Los Angeles. And a new kid going to school, especially a farm kid, didn't fare very well. And I mean, I just didn't get along with city kids for some stupid reason. They picked on me, but that was no big deal. Anyhow, I was down there a couple of years, and then Dad got into the dairy business in the early 30s. He bought out, I can't remember the guy's name, but he lived out by where the swimming pool was out there, the other side of town, the one that was ruined when the earthquakes hit. anyhow, that's where I learned to swim. And on the on the dairy, he finally bought out the guy that had the dairy on the Clifton, what is it now referred to as a Clifton Ranch, and I peddled milk. And every year I got 2 weeks vacation. And of course I had to work every Saturday and Sunday. And my day started at 12 o'clock midnight, and I peddled milk till 9 o'clock, and then went to school.
Wow.
And I was going to high school. In 1935, when they had the earthquake, they damaged the schoolhouse. The entire auditorium fell down, and some of the halls were some of the rooms were badly damaged. And so they put out coach cars on the railroad track, down by the railroad track, and set up a
How many